probably hear better.
She's a good reader.
We're behind the speakers.
She's a reader.
For sound, you're probably going to move around a bit. Right now we're behind the speakers. So just keep going. Try to move up and cover and walking the person not rushing
Okay, you don't go anywhere. Not next to Daddy. Are you sure? Right there.
Just waiting for the last speaker to come up.
Yeah, no, it was good. Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, good morning, everyone. Nice to see so many people getting involved with oral history. This is wonderful.
Can you turn it up
I think you should give yourselves a round of applause. You're being part of this program. So we're changing things up a little bit. My name is Ken, not Richard. But you can call me Richard if you'd like. Ken Purvis, I'm formerly the Senior Program Officer at Fort York for many years, and now I'm out in Etobicoke at Montgomery's Inn. Montgomery's Inn, a restored tavern from the 1830s.
Turn it up!
Open daily, Tuesday through Sunday.
Louder!
We're at
Louder!
Louder! Please come on out and enjoy Toronto's museums. Support Toronto's museums. Are you cheering or telling me that you can't hear me?
Louder! Both! We're doing both!
A little bit of both. Okay. Well, you'll hear this in a moment, because I'm going to entertain you with some music. I'm going to set the scene for you. We're at kind of the penultimate phase, I guess, of the battle. So you've heard now about the landing and the British inability to halt the American landing. You've heard about the set piece behind us in the clearing near the French fort, the ruins of Fort Rouillé. And now this is the action at what we call the Western Battery. Now, what is a battery? Well, a battery is an artillery emplacement. And there wasn't really much of a battery here. It was kind of hastily thrown up in order to defend this route into the town and toward Fort York. So imagine, if you will, that we're right on Lake Ontario. We can see the vessels of the American fleet out in the lake. They are pummeling the shoreline, trying to soften the defenses in advance of their troops, who are mostly landed now and advancing from the west in a column along a narrow road along the water called simply the Bridle Path. Now, I like the way they've set up the speakers here, because now you are all in the position of the defenders. And assuming that we are mostly Canadian in this crowd, are we not? So you've got a great perspective from here, imagining that this enormous column of U.S. troops is approaching. We're outnumbered, we're beleaguered, we've been driven back, we've suffered casualties. Our army is now fully assembled, aside, of course, from our Aboriginal allies who have left. But we have been joined by the Glengarry Light Infantry from the north. We've been joined by Captain Eustace's company from the east. But we have been fighting a losing battle, essentially, because we are so overwhelmed. The odds are very much in favor of the U.S. So picture that American column approaching. And at the Battle of York on April 27th, 1813, as the Americans advanced, they advanced to the following tune. Their fifers and drummers struck up this. No, it's not the Barney song. It's called Yankee Doodle. and it was a favorite national air of the Americans at the time of the war. However, I would like to point out that that tune was in fact written by a British military surgeon and was designed to kind of poke fun at the Americans. But after the American Revolution, they kind of adopted it as their own, and so in the War of 1812, you have both sides playing it at each other. So the Americans played it at the British here at York, but the British would also play that tune as American prisoners from Queenston Heights were marched through the streets of Montreal. Careful down in front here. Okay, so what happened to the Western Battery? Once again, a battery is a gun emplacement that was hastily thrown up. It consisted of a small earthwork in the formation of what they called a bastion, and there were two guns here, two 18-pounder long guns that unfortunately had been condemned by the Royal Artillery as no longer useful. In fact, at least one of those guns is still in the collection at Fort York, and I would invite you to have a look in the Blockhouse number 2 in Fort York. There's an artillery display, and one of those guns is there, and it's a very odd gun, and for many years we thought it was a French gun, a captured French gun, because it did not resemble British artillery from this era. Turns out it's not a French gun. The reason it doesn't look like British artillery from this era is because it's British artillery from a much earlier era. It was cast, in fact, during the age of Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s. A very, very ancient gun, even in 1813. And when they condemned guns in those days, what they would do is knock off the trunnions so that the gun could not be properly mounted on a carriage. Now, what are the trunnions? Well, you've seen trunnions, you just didn't know what they were called. They are the cylindrical things that extend out from the side of the cannon that allow it to be mounted on a carriage and allow it to be pivoted so it can be aimed in the, I guess, vertical plane. So when you don't have trunnions on your gun, it cannot be properly mounted. So one of the guns here at the Western Battery was on a raised platform aiming out over the lake, which did manage to do some damage to the US fleet. At least one ship took a hit from that gun, and they had to cut cable and move to a safer position. The other gun, though, was mounted in a log pointing in the direction of the US advance. They couldn't aim it properly, and so a lot of the shot was simply flying over the heads of the American column and not really doing any damage. Column, incidentally, is the most efficient way of moving infantry from point A to point B. And then when you get to point B, you deploy them into a line formation so that they can bring all of their muskets to bear on the enemy. However, when they are in column, they are very susceptible to artillery fire. You can imagine a long column of soldiers and a solid shot smashing through that column. So there was the potential here for great damage, but because these guns were condemned, they weren't terribly useful, and the effect was not great, shall we say. There are accounts of some of the American soldiers having their pikes shattered by the artillery fire. A pike is a long wooden post, basically, with an iron tip at the end. So the shot is flying over their heads and smashing some of their weaponry, but not actually killing any or wounding any enemy troops. And then there was an accident. Unfortunately, we have a magazine explosion. I'm not going to give away the end, by the way, but this isn't the magazine explosion that some of you are maybe thinking of. This was a minor accident, but it was major enough to render the Western Battery completely useless. One of the gunners, who was holding the port fire stick, which they used to fire the cannon, to ignite the powder in the tube of the cannon, stepped back and placed the port fire stick behind him, waiting for the signal to fire. This was the gun that was up on the platform aiming out over the lake. And a couple of officers ascended the bastion so that they could see the effect of the shot on the US ship. The gunner put the match behind him and stuck it right into the portable gunpowder magazine. And the explosion which followed knocked the guns off of their makeshift carriages and blasted, while about 20 men were killed in the explosion and an additional 10 were wounded. And what I'd like to do is just read for you a couple of eyewitness accounts of that actual event, which took place roughly around 10 a.m. So we're, what, 11:30 to 20 to 12. So 200 years ago today, but about an hour and a half ago, this explosion took place. So first, an account from the defenders. While this part of our force was contending with the enemy in the woods, an unfortunate accident occurred in the battery opposite to the fleet, which proved a death blow to the little hope that might have been entertained of a successful issue to the proceedings of the day. A gun was aimed at one of the vessels, and the officers, desirous of seeing if the ball would take effect, ascended the bastion. In the meantime, the artilleryman, waiting for the word of command to fire, held the match behind him, as is usual under such circumstances, and the traveling magazine, a large wooden chest containing cartridges for the great guns, being opened just at his back, he unfortunately put the match into it, and the consequence, as may be supposed, was dreadful indeed. Every man in the battery was blown into the air, and the dissection of the greater part of their bodies was inconceivably shocking. The officers were thrown from the bastion by the shock, but escaped with a few bruises. The cannons were dismounted, and consequently the battery was rendered completely useless. And now from out on one of the ships. There was about 3/4 of a mile off an 18-pound battery. They opened their fire upon us, and I verily believe that as many as 3 of those 18-pound shot passed over our heads within 3 to 5 feet. I own right up, I did not relish that breakfast much. The fair American received a shot in her bow. They cut her cable and stood for a more secure berth. The Commodore was an old tar, and sailor every inch of him. As he commenced to give us orders, a hurrah was heard from the men. I cast my eyes to the battery, and over the tops of the pine trees, whirling in the air, saw quite a number of men, some 20 or 30. Their magazine, which had been under the bastion, had blown up and killed everything about it and made a complete wreck of their little fort. Breakfast was done. So there we have the action of the Western Battery. So what I'm going to ask all of you now to do is to proceed following our marshals. You'll see a chap with a white hat back there, one of our many Richards today. You're going to cross, go through the gates, the black gates and the princess gates, turn north, up strong so that we can all cross together to get into Fort York. Thank you very much for your attention this morning, everyone.
A little hope.